The rain fell in heavy sheets, turning the streets into small rivers that flowed between broken walls and shattered roads. The sky was dark with heavy clouds that hid the moon, and the air smelled of wet stone and old smoke. A human traveler moved slowly under the shadow of a broken bridge, his coat soaked and his boots splashing in shallow water. He had come into the ruined alien city, searching for shelter from the storm, but what he found instead was something he could not ignore. The blur of rain, he saw a small figure stumbling along the street. The figure was hunched against the cold, holding a torn scarf close to her chest. She moved without direction, her bare feet sinking into the water with each slow step. The traveler could see now that she was young, very young, her skin a faint pale blue, her hair silver and plastered to her head by the rain. She whispered something over and over in her own language, her voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. The traveler stayed still, hidden in the shadow, watching her from under the bridge. Then his eyes caught movement further down the road. Tall, armored figures were moving through the rain, their red visors glowing faintly as they scanned the empty buildings. These were not here to help. They were hunters, their weapons held ready, their movements sharp and precise. The traveler realized quickly that they were looking for the girl and that they were closing in on her position. The girl turned a corner and for a moment disappeared from his sight. The traveler stepped forward, moving quickly across the flooded street. The cold water soaking through his boots, he caught up with her just as she paused near a collapsed building, her small shoulders shaking from cold and fear. She did not see him until he was close enough to reach out his hand. She froze, staring at him, her wide silver eyes filled with confusion and mistrust. He raised his hand slowly, showing his empty palm to tell her he meant no harm. But she stepped back, clutching the scarf tighter to her chest. The sound of the hunters' boots grew louder, splashing in the rain as they approached from the other street. The traveler glanced toward the noise, then back at her. There was no time to explain. He stepped forward and pulled her gently but firmly into the shelter of a narrow leak, Raleigh pressing his back against the wall as the hunters passed by just meters away. The girl tensed in his grip, her breathing fast and shallow. The traveler kept his eyes on the street until the glowing red visors faded into the distance. He released her arm and she stepped back, still watching him warily. He pointed away from the street and toward the deeper shadows of the alley. She hesitated, then took a small step forward. Following his lead, the rain poured down harder, soaking them both as they moved through twisting backways, avoiding open streets. They passed through a narrow passage where the walls leaned close together and into a courtyard littered with broken metal and shattered glass. The girl's bare feet slipped on the wet ground, and he caught her before she could fall. She murmured something in her language, but he could not understand her. Still, the tone was clear. She was scared and exhausted. She looked younger than he had first thought, perhaps only a child by human years. Sudden light swept across the courtyard, forcing them both to freeze. The hunter's drone hovered above, scanning with a cone of pale blue light. The traveler pulled her under the remains of a collapsed awning, holding her close until the light passed. The drone drifted away and vanished behind the rooftops. The traveler let out a slow breath before guiding her toward another alley, this one leading deeper into the city. The storm showed no sign of stopping, water running down every wall and pooling in every low place. The sound of it was constant, loud enough to mask the smaller noises of their steps, but not enough to hide the metallic echoes of the hunters somewhere behind them. The girl's breathing grew heavier each time they stopped to listen, and her hands trembled as she clutched the scarf closer to herself. The traveler noticed it was not just a scarf, but a piece of fabric carefully embroidered with a pattern that looked like the night sky. Reached a small square where a cracked statue stood half submerged in water. The traveler stopped, scanning the paths leading away from it. One path sloped upward toward the edge of the city, the other led toward a cluster of taller buildings. The girl tugged lightly at his sleeve, pointing toward the upward path. He looked at her for a moment, then nodded, and they began moving again. The water shallower here, but the wind stronger. Cutting through the wet fabric of their clothes, they had only gone a short distance when the sound returned louder than before the deep mechanical hum of the hunter's main transport. The traveler's eyes narrowed as he saw a glow ahead through the rain, the massive dark shape of the vehicle blocking the road, its lights sweeping the area. The girl's grip tightened on his arm, her small frame pressing closer as if she could hide within his shadow. He knew they had reached a dead end, and that turning back meant running straight into the hunters who were already closing in. The rain fell harder, stinging their skin. The hum of the transport growing louder as its engines powered up. The traveler looked down at the girl, her eyes locked on his, waiting for him to decide. She had lost everything tonight, her home, her family, her mother. Now she stood in the storm with only him between her and the enemy. He knew then that walking away was no longer possible. He took her hand and squeezed it once before, pulling her toward the side of the road where a narrow gap between two buildings might lead to safety. They splashed through the water into the dark, the noise of the hunters following close behind, the storm swallowing their footsteps. As they vanished into the shadows, the narrow gap between the two buildings was dark and filled with debris. The human traveler moved quickly, pulling the alien girl after him, her small feet splashing in the shallow water that ran like a stream through the passage. The sound of the hunters echoed behind them, heavy boots striking the flooded streets in a steady rhythm. The rain was still falling hard, turning the air into a wall of mist that blurred every shape into shadows. They reached the end of the passage and found themselves in another street, this one narrower but still exposed. The human glanced both ways before choosing the path that sloped downward toward the older part of the city. He knew the hunters would search the main roads first, and that their best chance lay in the maze of crumbling alleys and half-collapsed buildings. The girl kept close, her hand gripping his tightly, her eyes darting to every movement in the shadows. The water here was deeper, pooling up to their ankles and sending ripples with every step they took. The human moved in silence, his senses sharp for any sign of danger. They passed under a broken balcony where loose boards creaked in the wind. The girl glanced upward, her expression tense. The human followed her gaze just in time to see a small drone pass overhead, its scanning light slicing through the rain. They pressed themselves against the wall, holding still as the beam swept across the street and moved on once the drone was gone. They continued moving faster, now weaving between piles of rubble. The human led her through a doorway into the shell of an old shop, the shelves long empty, the windows shattered, rain blowing in through the gaps. He guided her to the back, where another exit led into a courtyard, this one overgrown with tall wet grass that bent under the weight of the rain. The sound of the storm was louder here, masking their movements as they crossed to the far side. They slipped into another alley, but this one was blocked halfway by fallen masonry. The human climbed over first, then reached down to lift the girl up. Her feet slipped on the wet stone, but his grip was firm, pulling her safely to the other side. They landed in a shallow puddle, the cold water soaking into their clothes. The girl shivered, but said nothing, her eyes fixed on him, as if drawing courage from his calm focus. Sudden burst of light illuminated the alley behind them, followed by the harsh metallic voice of a hunter, amplified through a helmet speaker. The words were not in the human's language, but the meaning was clear. They were telling her to stop. The human did not look back. He took her hand and ran, the water splashing high around them as they sprinted toward the end of the alley. The path opened into a wider street, and for a moment the rain thinned enough for the human to see the tall outline of the city wall. In the distance beyond that lay the countryside and perhaps safety he knew they would never make it there without the hunters noticing, but he also knew staying in the city meant certain capture. He turned left, heading toward the wall, using the shadows of leaning buildings for cover. The girl followed without hesitation, though her steps were slower now from exhaustion. They reached a section where the street dipped low and the water was nearly knee deep. The human waded through quickly, lifting the girl to keep her from sinking. Into the muddy ground, the cold bit into his legs, but he pushed forward the sound of the hunters, now mixed with the steady hum of their transport engines somewhere. Close, the girl's head turned toward the noise, her silver eyes wide with fear. The human gave her a quick, reassuring nod before setting her down again once they reached higher ground. The buildings here were older, their walls cracked and covered with vines. Some had collapsed entirely, leaving open spaces that gave them little cover. The human guided her into one of these ruins, stepping carefully over broken beams and rusted metal. The rain drummed against the remaining parts of the roof, the sound blending with the distant thunder. They reached the far side of the ruin, where a narrow passage led toward the wall, but before they could take it, the glow of a red visor appeared at the other end. The human reacted instantly, pulling the girl behind a pile of rubble as the hunter advanced. The sound of water splashing under heavy boots. Coming closer, he reached for a length of rusted pipe lying nearby, gripping it tightly. The girl's small hand clung to his sleeve, her breath quick and shallow. The hunter stepped into the ruin, scanning with his weapon, raised. The human waited until the red glow swept past their hiding place, then moved swiftly, striking the hunter's helmet with the pipe. The blow rang out over the storm. The hunter staggered and fell into the water. Human grabbed the girl's hand and pulled her through the passage, their boots slipping on the wet stones as they ran, the rain falling harder now, as if the sky itself was trying to drown the city. The wall was close now, only a few streets away, but the roar of the transport engines grew louder and brighter lights cut through the mist ahead. The girl gasped, pointing toward the road, where the massive dark shape of the hunter transport blocked their path. They ducked into another alley, trying to circle around, but the sound of more boots came from both directions. The girl's eyes darted wildly, as if searching for an escape. The human's mind raced for a plan. The storm beat against them mercilessly, and the walls around them felt like they were closing in. He knew they were running out of options fast. Then his gaze caught a narrow metal staircase bolted to the side of a building leading upward into the darkness. Without a word, he pulled the girl toward it, their feet clanging softly against the wet steps as they climbed, each movement carrying them higher away from the streets below, but closer to the rooftops, where the hunters might still be waiting. The metal staircase shook under their weight as they climbed, rainwater streaming down its rusted steps. The human kept the alien girl ahead of him, using his body to shield her from the open street below. The wind was strong on the higher levels, pushing against them and carrying the distant sound of the hunter transport still searching somewhere. In the city, they reached the top and stepped onto the flat roof, slick with rain. The human crouched low, moving quickly toward the far side, where another set of steps led down into a connected building. The building's roof had partially collapsed, letting in sheets of rain, but it also meant there was a way inside. The human guided the girl through the gap, and they climbed down into darkness, their boots splashing into shallow water. The air smelled of rust and oil and old dust. It was quiet except for the sound of water dripping from the broken ceiling above. As the human's eyes adjusted, he realized they were in what had once been a large factory. Tall machines stood like silent towers, their surfaces slick with moisture and streaked with rust. Conveyor belts hung in tatters, and piles of broken parts littered the floor. The girl looked around wide-eyed, her silver hair clinging to her face. The human scanned the shadows for movement, then motioned for her to follow. They moved between the machines, their steps careful and slow, every noise echoing through the vast space they found. A small corner tucked behind a row of machinery, where a wall panel still stood upright, offering a bit of shelter from the dripping water. The human set down his pack and pulled out a small piece of cloth, handing it to the girl. She took it hesitantly, then began drying her face, her hands trembling from the cold. He knelt beside her, checking her bare feet for cuts or injuries. Finding only scrapes from their flight through the rubble, a faint clang echoed from somewhere deep inside the factory. The human froze his hand, instinctively going to the metal pipe he still carried. He motioned for the girl to stay quiet, her wide eyes fixed on him as he moved toward. The sound weaving between the machines, the clang came again, slower this time. Like deliberate footsteps against metal flooring, he reached a row of storage crates and crouched low, peering around the edge. The dim light, he saw nothing but shadows stretching between the machines, yet the sense of being watched crawled along his skin. He backed away slowly, returning to the girl who was now curled against the wall, clutching her scarf tighter than before. He sat beside her, speaking in a low voice, telling her they would rest here for a short while before moving again. She did not understand all his words, but she seemed to take comfort from the tone. Human pulled a small packet of dried food from his pack, breaking it into smaller pieces and offering one to her. She hesitated before taking it, chewing slowly, her gaze never leaving his face for long after she finished. She reached into the folds of her scarf and pulled out a small metal pendant shaped like a star. The edges worn smooth with age. She held it out for him to see, pointing to her chest, then looking upward as if the pendant was more than just an ornament but a memory. He nodded, understanding enough to know it was important. They had only been sitting for a few minutes when the sound returned, this time closer. The human rose to his feet, his eyes scanning the dim aisles between machines. Then from the far side of the factory, a faint red glow appeared, moving slowly through the shadows. The girl's body tensed as she saw it. The glow grew brighter, revealing the tall, armored shape of a hunter, its head turning from side to side as it surged. Human pulled the girl behind the nearest machine, pressing his back to the cold metal. The hunter's footsteps echoed closer, each one deliberate and heavy. He tightened his grip on the pipe, ready to strike if it came too near. The girl's breathing was shallow, almost silent, but he could feel her trembling against him. The red glow passed just a few meters away before pausing. The hunter's head tilted, as if listening to the sound of dripping water. Then it moved on, disappearing between two distant machines. The human waited until the sound faded before signaling the girl to follow. They moved deeper into the factory, away from the path the hunter had taken. The air grew colder and the floor more cluttered with debris until they came to a metal door, half rusted shut. He forced it open with a loud groan of hinges, wincing at the noise. On the other side was a smaller room lined with empty shelves and a single broken workbench. It was not much, but it was hidden enough for them to take a brief rest. Girl sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. The human knelt beside her, wrapping part of his coat around her shoulders. To keep her warm, he could hear faint noises outside the room, not close, but not far either. The hunters were still moving through the factory, and it was only a matter of time before they swept this section. To the human's mind, raced through possible escape routes, but each one carried its own risk. The girl reached for his hand, holding it tightly as if she knew the danger was not over. He squeezed her fingers gently and gave her a small nod. The rain outside the broken windows began to slow the storm, losing some of its fury, but that also meant the sound of movement would carry farther through the empty streets, and the hunters would hear more than before. The human knew they could not stay in the factory much longer. Soon they would have to run again. The human kept his back against the wall, listening to the faint echoes moving through the factory. The rain had slowed outside, and the air inside felt heavier, carrying every sound across the wide, empty space. The alien girl sat wrapped in part of his coat, her small hands gripping the fabric tightly, her silver eyes fixed on the doorway, as if expecting danger to step through at any moment. Human adjusted his hold on the metal pipe, his only real weapon, and signaled for the girl to stay where she was. He stepped toward the door, leaning just enough to glance into the main area. The factory floor stretched out before him in shadow and rust, the tall machines casting long shapes in the dim light. Then a sudden flicker of red appeared between two broken conveyor belts, the glow steady and cold. The hunter moved with slow, deliberate steps, scanning each row of machines, its weapon held ready. The sound of its boots on the wet floor sharpened the silence. The human's grip tightened on the pipe as he watched the hunter draw closer. It paused now and then, tilting its head as if listening for the faintest noise. The girl stayed silent, her breath slow, but her body tense, every muscle ready to run if he told her the hunters. Red Visor swept toward their corner, and for a moment the human thought it had seen them. He pressed back against the wall, motioning for the girl to stay hidden. Then the hunter stepped forward, again closing the distance, each step sounding louder. Then the last, the human's heartbeat matched. The rhythm of those boots. He waited until the hunter passed their hiding place before moving swiftly from the shadows. With a sudden swing, he brought the pipe down hard against the back of the hunter's helmet. The impact rang out through the factory. The hunter staggered forward, letting out a metallic growl before turning its head, the red glow flaring brighter. It swung its weapon toward him, but he was already stepping inside its reach, jamming the end of the pipe into the side of its armor. Sparks flew as metal scraped against metal. The hunter lashed out with one arm, catching him in the shoulder, and sending him stumbling back. The girl's voice rang out in a sharp cry as the hunter turned toward her. Its weapon, rising instinct, took over. She raised her hands, and a burst of light erupted from her palms, a blinding flash that filled the space. Between them, the hunter recoiled, stumbling against the nearest machine the human seized. The chance charging forward and swinging the pipe again, this time striking the weapon from the hunter's grip. It clattered across the floor and slid into the shadows. The hunter roared in frustration, lunging toward him with claws extended. The human ducked under the strike, driving the pipe into its chest, the force knocking it back into a stack of rusted shelves. The shelves collapsed with a deafening crash, sending dust and debris into the air. The human stepped back, gasping for breath as the hunter struggled to rise from the wreckage. The girl moved to his side, her face pale and her body shaking from the energy she had used. They had no time to recover. The sound of more footsteps echoed from deeper in the factory, fast and heavy. The human realized the fight had drawn attention, and now more were coming. He grabbed the girl's hand, pulling her toward the rear of the room. They ran through a narrow aisle between machines, their steps splashing in shallow puddles. The girl stumbled once, but he caught her, pulling her back up without slowing. They reached a side door half hidden behind a stack of broken pallets. The human shoved it open, the rusted hinges screaming in protest. The cold air of the outside rushed in, carrying the smell of wet stone and oil. They slipped through into a narrow service alley, the rain falling in lighter drops. Now the sound of pursuit growing louder behind them. The girl clung to his arm, her silver eyes scanning the shadows ahead. The alley opened into a small yard surrounded by high walls. A single gate standing half open. The human pushed her through first, then followed, closing the gate behind them. As quietly as he could, they moved along another narrow path lined with rusted pipes. The sound of the city muted here, as if the walls held back more than just the rain. He led her toward a gap between two buildings, knowing they had to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the factory. But just as they stepped into the open, a shadow detached itself from the wall ahead, another hunter blocking their path, its red visor glowing in the gloom. The human stepped in front of the girl, raising the pipe again. The hunter's weapon hummed with energy, ready to fire. The human's muscles tightened, preparing to move, but before the shot could come, the girl stepped beside him, her hands lifting slowly, her expression calm despite the danger. A faint glow building in her palms. The hunter hesitated, as if sensing the same strange power that had blinded its companion. Earlier, the glow grew brighter until it filled the alley with pale light. The human waited until the hunter shifted its stance, then moved in fast. The pipe struck the weapon, knocking it aside. The hunter swung a clawed hand at him, but he ducked low, driving the pipe into its knee. The creature staggered. The girl released the burst of light, and the hunter fell back, crashing against the wall. Human grabbed her hand again, and they ran without looking back, their footsteps echoing along the empty street. The fight had bought them a few more minutes, but he knew the hunters would not stop now. The first confrontation was over, yet the true hunt had only just begun. The human and the alien girl moved quickly through the empty street, their boots splashing through shallow puddles left. By the storm, the air was cold and heavy, carrying the faint hum of hunter transport somewhere behind them. The fight at the factory had left them both drained. The human's shoulder ached from the blow he had taken, and the girl's hands still trembled from using her strange power, but neither slowed there. Pace they reached the edge of the city, where the cracked road sloped downward into open land. What had once been farmland now lay under water, the fields flooded from weeks of rain, the moon's pale light reflected off the surface, turning it into a shimmering expanse broken only by clusters of dead trees. The human stopped for a moment, scanning the horizon. He knew crossing this open ground would leave them exposed, but the hunters were close, and staying meant certain capture. The girl looked up at him, her silver eyes searching for an answer. He gave a short nod, then led her down the slope. The water was cold and murky, rising quickly from their ankles to their knees, each step slow and heavy as the mud pulled at their boots. The girl gasped softly at the chill, but kept moving, her scarf clutched tightly to her chest. The human kept one hand on her shoulder, guiding her through the deeper parts, the sound of the water rippling around them loud in the otherwise silent night. Halfway across they heard the first searchlight sweep over the flooded fields. A pale beam cutting through the darkness, the human pulled her down into the shadow of a fallen tree, its bare branches reaching out of the water like the bones of some long dead creature. The beam passed over them once, twice, then moved on the hum of the transport engines, drifting closer on the wind. The girl pressed against him, her breathing quick as they waited for the light to fade. When it was gone, they began moving again, weaving between patches of higher ground and deeper pools. The human kept his eyes on the far edge, where the dark line of the forest waited. The hunters would have more trouble tracking them among the trees, but the distance was still far, and the open water gave no cover. The moon slipped behind a cloud, plunging the fields into deeper darkness, and for a moment they could hear only the sound of their own movements. Then came the low thrum of another engine, this one much closer. The girl's hand tightened on his sleeve as a second beam of light swept across the water from the opposite direction. They crouched low, moving as quickly as they could while staying in the beam's blind spots. The human's heart pounded with each second the light passed near them, every ripple of water feeling like it might betray their position. The girl's scarf trailed in the water, but she kept her grip on it as if letting go would mean losing the last piece of her past. The ground rose slightly ahead, and they climbed onto a narrow strip of dry land. The human paused to catch his breath, listening for the sound of pursuit. Behind them, the engines were still there, but further away, as if the hunters were searching other parts of the fields. He urged her onward, the forest now close enough to see the shapes of trees in the dim light. But as they reached the last stretch of open ground, movement caught his eye. Dark shapes emerged from the tree line, tall and broad, their red visors glowing faintly. Even in the distance, the hunters had anticipated their path. The human stopped for only a heartbeat before pulling the girl toward a cluster of half-submerged ruins to their right. If they could circle around, they might find another way into the forest without passing through the ambush. The water there was deeper, reaching almost to his waist, the cold biting through his clothes, but he pushed forward. Ruins rose out of the water in jagged shapes, walls broken, and roofs collapsed. The girl clung to him as they moved between the crumbling structures, her eyes wide at the eerie silence here. The hunters on the shore began moving toward them, their progress slowed by the water, but still steady. The human quickened his pace, guiding her through narrow gaps in the walls until they reached the far side, where a fallen tower lay across the water like a bridge. He tested the surface with one foot, the stones slick but stable enough for their weight. He motioned for her to cross first. She moved carefully, arms out for balance, the scarf fluttering in the wind. He followed close behind, glancing over his shoulder to see the hunters closing the gap. Halfway across, a piece of the tower shifted under his steps, sending a spray of water into the air, but it held long enough for them to reach the other side. The forest loomed ahead, dark and silent, its branches forming a barrier against the moonlight. They stepped onto solid ground, the girl sagging with relief. But the human knew they could not rest, yet the hunters would not give up, simply because they had reached cover. He led her into the trees, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of wet leaves. The sound of the engines fading behind them, replaced by the quiet drip of water from the branches above, they moved deeper into the forest, the path twisting between thick trunks. The air here heavy with the scent of earth and moss. The girl's breathing slowed as the pace eased slightly, but she stayed close, her hand still gripping his arm. The human listened carefully for any sign of pursuit, but for now, the night belonged to the forest. And the hunters were somewhere far behind. The forest was thick and silent, except for the faint squelch of wet earth under their boots. The human kept the alien girl close, guiding her around fallen branches and through narrow gaps between the trees. The moonlight barely reached the forest floor, leaving everything in shades of black and gray. The air smelled of damp soil and rain. The sound of the hunter engines had faded for a time, but he knew they would not stay gone for long. They never stopped once they had a target. The girl stumbled once, her foot catching on a root. The human caught her before she fell. Her silver eyes met his briefly before she nodded to show she was ready to keep going. They pressed forward until the trees began to thin ahead, revealing a narrow valley and the dark shape of an old bridge spanning the rushing river below. The wooden planks were slick with rain, and the ropes that held it swayed in the wind, but it was the only way across without losing hours. They did not have the human slowed, scanning the far side of the bridge for movement. At first, it seemed empty. Then the faintest glimmer of red light flickered between the trees. His stomach tightened. The hunters were already there, waiting. The girl followed his gaze, her grip on his arm tightening, her breath quickening. He could feel her fear, but he also knew turning back was not an option. The hunters would soon close in from behind, trapping them in the valley. Guided her onto the bridge, the old wood groaning under their combined weight. The ropes creaked with each step, the sound carrying through the cold night. The river below roared with the force of the rain-swollen currents spraying fine mist up onto the bridge. Halfway across, the girl looked over the side and quickly turned her eyes forward, her small frame leaning toward him as if afraid the bridge might throw her into the water. From the far side came the sound of movement. The hunters stepped into view, tall and dark, their red visors cutting through the mist. One raised a weapon, the hum of its charge audible even over the river. The human pushed the girl behind him and dropped low, moving forward with controlled speed. He had no rifle, no shield, only the metal pipe gripped tight in his hand. The bridge swayed violently as a gust of wind tore through the valley. First shot came bright and fast, burning through one of the ropes holding the side of the bridge. The whole structure tilted dangerously, forcing the human and the girl to cling to the other rope for balance. He kept moving, pushing her ahead, telling her without words to run to the far end. The hunters advanced slowly, firing again, the shots splintering wood and sending pieces falling into the churning river below. Sing the last few planks before the far side, the girl turned to see the human swinging the pipe with all his strength, striking one of the hunters in the chest. The impact forced it back a step, but another moved in fast, swinging a clawed hand that tore through part of the bridge floor. The human dodged narrowly the plank beneath, his foot breaking away and dropping into the water. He barely caught the rope to keep from falling. The girl cried out and reached toward him. He hauled himself back onto the bridge just as another shot passed so close it burned through his sleeve. Without slowing, he lunged forward, smashing the pipe into the weapon of the nearest hunter. The weapon spun out of its grip, falling into the river. The hunter roared and shoved him back, but the girl stepped forward, her hands glowing with that strange light. she had used before the burst of brightness was blinding in the mist. The hunters staggered. Clutching its visor, the human seized the moment, driving the pipe into its side with a crack that sent it tumbling over the edge into the river. The other hunters hesitated just long enough for him to push the girl toward the far end. They leaped from the last planks onto solid ground, the girl stumbling but staying upright. The hunters began to follow, but the human turned back, gripping the rope that still held the damaged side of the bridge with all his weight. He yanked hard, the frayed fibers giving way with a sharp snap. The bridge tilted sharply, sending the nearest hunter sliding toward the edge. It tried to grab hold, but the slick wood offered no grip, and it fell into the river. Vanishing into the darkness, the remaining hunters on the far side stopped their pursuit for the moment, their visors glowing in the mist. As they watched from across the gap, the human stood breathing hard, the pipe hanging loosely in his hand. The girl stood beside him, her shoulders rising and falling quickly, her silver eyes locked on the hunters as if daring them to try again. The river roared between them, the broken bridge swaying in the wind. He turned to her and gave a short nod without speaking. They moved into the trees on the far side, putting distance between themselves and the valley each step, carrying them deeper into the forest, away from the bridge, but not away from the danger. He knew the hunters would find another way across, and that this fight was far from over. But for now, they had bought time, and in this hunt, time was life. Forest on the far side of the bridge was thick and dark, the air damp and heavy with the scent of wet leaves. The human kept moving with steady steps, guiding the alien girl deeper into the trees, each footstep muffled by the thick layer of moss. Underfoot, the roar of the river faded slowly behind them, replaced by the quiet sounds of the forest at night. But neither of them felt safe enough to stop. The girl stayed close, her silver eyes scanning the shadows, her scarf now damp and torn, but still clutched tightly in her hands. Her breathing had slowed, though the tension in her shoulders had not eased. The human glanced back at her, from time to time seeing the exhaustion on her face, but also the quiet determination that had carried her through everything since the night began. He could feel the same determination in himself, the unspoken promise that no matter what came, they would see it through together. They walked for what felt like hours until the trees began to thin, and the faint glow of the early morning sky appeared through the branches. The human led her toward a rise in the ground where an old cabin stood, half hidden by ivy and fallen leaves, its roof sagging slightly, but the walls still solid. He pushed the door open with a soft groan of wood, revealing a single room that smelled faintly of dust and old rain, but to him it felt like safety inside. He set down his pack and moved to check the windows and the door. The girl wandered slowly around the space, her fingers brushing over the wooden table and the cracked ceramic bowl on the shelf, as if memorizing every detail. She stopped at the small fireplace in the corner, crouching to run her hand over the cold stones. The human knelt beside her, striking a match, and soon a small fire crackled to life, casting flickering light across the room. The warmth began to ease the chill from their soaked clothes. She sat close to the fire, leaning toward it. With her eyes half closed, the human watched her for a moment before pulling a small loaf of bread from his pack, breaking it in half, and handing her the larger piece. She hesitated, then accepted it, eating slowly as though savoring every bite. He ate his share, quickly, his mind still half on the forest beyond the walls, listening for any sound that might mean the hunters had found another way across the river. After they finished, he took the scarf from her, gently holding it up to the firelight to examine the embroidered pattern. It looked like a map of stars and night sky captured in thread. He handed it back to her, and she folded it carefully, placing it over her shoulders. She looked at him for a long moment, then spoke in her language, the words unfamiliar, but the tone soft and certain. He could not understand the details, but he knew what she was telling him. She was thanking him. The sound of the wind outside rose for a moment, rattling the shutters, but there was no other noise. No engines, no boots, no glow of red visors between. The trees the human allowed himself to relax just a little enough to sit by the fire with his back against the wall. The girl leaned against him. Her small frame warm in the firelight, her breathing steady for the first time since he had found her. In the rain, as the light outside grew brighter, he thought of the road ahead. The hunters would not stop. They might not be here now, but they would search, and they would find a way to cross the river. When they did, he would be ready. The cabin could hold for a while, but it would not last forever. Yet in this moment, with the fire warm and the girl safe beside him forever, felt like something worth believing in. The girl stirred, lifting her head to look at him, her silver eyes bright in the morning light. She reached out and placed her small hand over his, her fingers curling lightly around his. He returned the gesture, feeling the weight of everything they had been through in that single touch. They had no blood bond, no shared past before this night, but they had something stronger, the choice to stand together no matter the cost. He rose after a time, stepping to the window and looking out across the forest. The sunlight broke through the clouds in thin golden lines, touching the tops of the trees. The river glimmered faintly in the distance, marking the line they had crossed together. He could not see the hunters, but he could feel the truth. They would come again. It was only a matter of when. He turned back to the girl, who now sat on the floor near the fire, her scarf wrapped around her shoulders, her expression calmed. Human walked back to her, crouching down so they were at eye level. He spoke slowly, clearly, telling her in his language that this place was now her home, that no one would take her from it. She listened carefully, her head tilting slightly. Then she gave a small nod, a faint smile touching her lips. She leaned forward, resting her forehead briefly against his in a gesture that needed no translation. The forest moved with the slow rhythm of wind and branches. The world beyond the cabin was still dangerous, but inside they had carved out a small circle of safety. Together, he knew that whatever came, they would face it side by side. The firelight reflected in her silver eyes as she looked at him, and in that quiet moment, the promise they had both made without words became the truth of their lives. They would protect each other, they would be each other's family, and they would